All right, hello again. This is Jeff Scott for the 152-161 ASP.NET class. I've got several chapters that I have to finish lecturing on before the semester ends, and I've decided for whatever reason to do it in a little bit of an off order. So I'm doing Chapter 19 today. Today is Tuesday, December 1st. I hope to be able to do, I've already done Chapter 18, so I hope to do Chapter 17, which is personalization, tomorrow, December 2nd, and then I hope to do Chapter 16 on security on December 3rd, Thursday. Then next week when I come in, I hope to come in on December 7th or whatever that is, the 7th and the 8th, and do the last two chapters, which are 14 and 15. All right, now this is going to be a different kind of chapter because we don't actually have the mechanism, I don't believe at least, available for us to be able to go out and actually deploy a website. I was hoping that we'd be able to deploy this on Site 5, but I talked to John, and Site 5 is a Starnix or a Linux, Unix type of setup, and in order to be able to deploy a website, you need to be able to work with IIS, which means it's got to be a Microsoft type of setup. There are IIS emulators. I didn't really have the time to go and look one up, set it up, get it to work, and then deploy this, but let's just talk about some of the stuff that is involved in deploying a website. So as you can see, we've got about 5 different objectives here. How to ease the deployment process through simple changes to your code and configuration. Believe it or not, we've already talked about some of those. How to publish your site directly from Visual Studio. How to install and configure a web server and your website on your target machine. How to avoid common errors you might come up with when you try to deploy a website, and how to copy data stored in your SQL Server database to the target server. So the author says, if you reach this point, you reach the end of the chapter. To make your website accessible worldwide, you need to publish it to a production server so other people can see it. All right. So as mentioned on the top of page 716, this chapter deals with some topics that are related to being able to successfully deploy a website. All right, as mentioned in here, we learn about different things from preparation to the actual deployment and a few other things that are going to literally have to take place. So the chapter ends, it says there, with kind of a checklist of things that you need to make sure that you do when you attempt to deploy a site. So it says when you're working on your first edition of your website, doing the deployment the first time isn't very difficult because you don't have anything to worry about backing up. You don't have anything that's there previously. You're kind of starting with a clean slate, so to speak. All right. So that's kind of what the author says in here. Again, I don't want to read to you. All right. It says this section shows you how to make some of the different, how to manage different versions of the same website and make them easier. So first thing to do, and we've talked about this in earlier classes, do not hard code things in whenever you can help it. All right, it says, for example, the contact form that sends out an email uses the following code here. And as mentioned, hard coding settings like this makes it difficult to give them different values in different environments. So what you want to do is you want to use expression syntax, which is basically going to say that we want to set something up either in our web config file, or we want to be able to set it up with expression syntax, meaning that we want to be able to set it up at runtime. All right. So the author mentions here on the top of 717 that several places in this book we've used web.config to store information about various things. Remember that typically the web.config file that's not associated with any folder, but it's just under the project itself, that is designed to store all of your system settings for the site. As mentioned, it's placed outside of the system.web element, these app settings, all right, but it's still within the configuration element. So we need a way to be able to access those at runtime, and one of those ways is, as mentioned right here, toward the middle of page 17, and that is using expression syntax. We've looked at this before, but the idea with this expression syntax, all right, is typically what you're doing is in a non.aspx file, you want to add some ASPX code. So they mention, as an example here, it says to display a copyright notice, you can add the following settings. Like this. It says then you can display this text in a literal control, and the key thing is using this right here. All right, you've set it up, and you've set up the key as being copyright, so you're setting up a key value pair here. All right, and you're doing this inside of your web config file. Then with the literal control, what this says basically is if this changes, all you have to do is change that particular setting, recompile, and as soon as you recompile and redeploy, it'll be reset for you. All right. So, as mentioned, Visual Studio comes with an expression editor to try to make this easier for you to do. All right. And just so you know, when they talk about a literal control, we haven't really talked about that, but a literal control is typically when you're just going to put text on a page. You're not going to associate it with a label. You're not going to associate it with a text box or anything else. So you don't want it basically to, it's not a non-ASP.NET HTML control. So it's not, just a browser web control, and it's not a server-side web control. It's just literal text. All right, that's all it's designed to be. So they mention here when you bring this up and you start to set the things up in here, you can set up these literal expressions any way you want. All right. So as mentioned, when you go through here and you set this up, and you've got text and you've got app settings and copyright, notice it says when you click OK, Visual Studio will modify the text property of the literal control so it contains the correct setting. All right. So this is typically what you're going to do if you've got things, some of the stuff that's mentioned in here, but when you've got things that are more global in nature. So as it says, getting values like this is useful, but it may not cover everything you need to do. All right. So it says it's good to know that you can retrieve values programmatically as well. Well, by now, hopefully, you've got to the point where you realize that virtually anything you can do in ASP.NET non-programmatically, you can also do programmatically. So they talk in here about the Web Configuration Manager class, and as mentioned, it provides access to data stored in configuration files. So notice what we have in here. Rather than trying to set something up as we did previously, we're setting it up in code. Again, since we're using C#, we're looking at this. So you have to make sure to do a using statement with your system.web.configuration namespace, because that provides the access for you to whatever is stored in the configuration files. And then we're setting up a variable to hold that information. All right. Then, as mentioned here, it says the get method always returns a string, so we need to convert it to the proper type. So notice it says here you need the following code to retrieve and convert the value. So we're doing this, we're adding that, but then we're basically saying we're trying to send an email. Whoop, we want the C# one. All right. Now, notice what the author mentions here, because he does have some very good thoughts, I think at least. It says, although you can access the Web Configuration Manager class directly in your code behind of your forms, it says he prefers to create static read-only properties to do this. And my thought, at least, is the main reason for doing this is by making something read-only like that, you're making it hard, if not impossible, for somebody to change it, unless they really know what they're doing. All right? So he goes through the steps in here to create a class with a few properties that get their values from the web.config file. So he creates a brand new class, removes all the constructor code, so it just looks like this. At the top of the file, he imports or does a using statement on the system.web.config file. He adds a new shared read-only property that returns this from address. So if we look at the code in here, this is the code that he puts in right here. So again, since it's in a get routine, you won't be able to change it. Notice there's no set here. It's just in a get routine. So he sets this up to grab for an email. So if you've got a standard way you want to set your emails up, a from name, a to address, and a to name, you'll be able to set them up like this. All right. Then he mentions, says, still inside, come on. It says, still inside the app configuration class, create a Boolean property called send mail on error. So notice, if the string is null or empty, return convert to Boolean result. Okay? And if it wasn't empty, then it was not found. All right, so he set these different properties. And he says, open the code behind. Now, this is about as heavy as it gets in this class. I've done very little with this. I've looked at the ASCX file. I haven't changed them very much, to be honest with you. So it says, open the code behind the contact form.ascx, locate the code that sets the from and to, replace the hard-coded properties, all right, like this. So in other words, what we've done is we've gone through and we've created a new class. In that class, we've grabbed information from our web.config file, but we've copied that information into read-only variables, and now we're setting the stuff up in code. So it says open the global.ascx file and wrap the entire code in application error in an if check. So it only runs if indeed we've had an error message. So he's saying add this here and ending here. All right. Finally, open web.config. Excuse me. Open web.config and add the following elements as it says right here. So we're going into our web config file, and that's where we're actually hard coding that stuff in. Save all the changes, go back to the home page, try to run it, then come in and change the setting here to false and request a non-existing page. As it says, because you changed the send mail on error settings, you shouldn't get an email with the exception details. All right. So what we have right here, starting on the bottom of page 722 and going on to 723, it says the properties of the app configuration class look in the web.config file for their settings. When the setting is not defined or does not contain a value, it throws an exception. Well, and why you'd want to do this is it says, especially when you're in the testing phase, you want to make sure that stuff is set up. So instead of silently returning an empty value, you now get an exception. All right. By storing values in the web.config as mentioned there instead of hard coding, your site is now easier to maintain and deploy. When you go live, all you need to do is create a copy of this, change a few settings, turn off the logging by email, because you wouldn't want that, of course, if you've got somebody who's using the application, you of course wouldn't want them to be able to come in there and see those error messages. Okay. All right. So it says, now that you've hard-coded your app settings, and when they move to the web.config file, the next step is to optimize your external CSS and JavaScript references. Let's put this in perspective here. What they're talking about doing here is minifying all of your CSS and your JavaScript. In other words, taking out the white space, taking out any unnecessary comments, and shrinking the size down. And what that'll do is that means that when you actually go to download these files, they'll download faster. And they'll download faster, all right? They will download faster because they're smaller, all right? Both of these features, bundling and minification, as mentioned, have been added in ASP.NET 4.5. They're designed to improve performance by minimizing the number and size of CSS and JavaScript files. Especially, minification we know about because we've talked about minified versions of things like your jQuery file. But the bundling is kind of cool because notice what's mentioned here on the top of 724. says they're simple to do and they require hardly any code. The author says, imagine you have two CSS files in a folder called 1.css and 2.css. Without bundling, you're going to have the two links. Makes sense. That's the way we've always done it. To enable bundling, it says you change these two lines into a single line. So notice how this is changed. You say href equals styles/CSS. So you just put down the name of the folder. Still rel equals style sheet, still type equals text/CSS. It says, notice that you no longer specify a file name in the folder name. Instead, you specify the file extension, CSS in this case, which instructs ASP.NET at runtime to grab every file with a .css extension. This may not seem like a big thing, but imagine that instead of 2 CSS files here, you had 30 CSS files. So the final result is it's going to be set up as though, in this case, it was 2 different files. All right. You can bundle and minify JavaScript files in the same way. It says one problem with the previous code here is that the browser caches the result for this, and even if you change the underlying files, the browser may continue to use the old files. If you've never had an issue with this before, congratulations. But what happens is when you're working with browsers, oftentimes, even if you've made a change in what you're working with in the browser, the system may not pick it up and it may still be using an old version of it. So they mention here, it says enabling bundling. All right. It says as long as the files are unmodified on disk and the same key is used, it won't change it. But as soon as you change one of the files, the key should change as well. When the key changes, it should send a message to the browser to request a fresh copy. So in other words, no matter what the cache time was set to, I should say, it should stay, grab a new copy anyway. So to enable bundling and minification, the process is shown here on page 724. You install the Microsoft.ASP.NET.Web.Optimization.Web form package using NuGet. We've done a little bit with NuGet. You enable bundling by writing code in global.asx. You remove the existing link and script tags. So they show you how to do this next. Create a new folder called styles. You go and you grab that package and put it in. All right. You open up global ASX and you add it also in there. You come into your code right here and you tell it to do the bundling. They're just showing the CSS here. The process that you'd use to bundle for JavaScript is similar. So they have you come in and add a new CSS file that's called test1.css that just changes your H1. It makes it underlined. Then they add another file called test2. So there's 2 files, test1.css and test2.css. The idea is if this works and we're able to bundle this into one file, now all H1 tags will both be underlined in green. So you open up the web.config, you find the compilation element, you set its debug attribute to false, you change your pages. All right, and what you should notice is when you open up your HTML tag and you start taking a look at what's in here, it should look like it's changed. And you can see that right in here. Now notice it says there that we've got a V parameter right there, V. It says the V parameter ensures that the browser always gets a fresh copy of the page if you make a change to the underlying CSS file. That will change depending on your machine. It says request the URL set in the href attribute. So it says there request it. So request this thing. And it should come in and look like this. In other words, it has now bundled those 2 files together. And if you go back and you delete the test2.css file and you request the home page again, remember, step 1 underlined it, step 2 turned it green. So after we bundle it, it was both underlined and green. But if we remove the second file, it's still underlined, it's no longer green. All right. I think we've kind of gone over how it works. Okay, so you've seen it here. And they mentioned on the top of page 727 here, it says the control you added to the master page is part of this optimization package. So a lot of this stuff, when you're starting to work with it, is going to be done for you. It's going to be kind of set up for you, but what you have to do is set up the steps on the system and tell the system, for lack of better words, what to do. All right, so now we've hopefully optimized the site. So now we prepare for deployment. And when you publish your site, there's actually 3 or 4 different ways of doing it. So it says, during development of your site, we used IIS Express. That's the built-in server that's on your machine. It ships with Visual Studio. The problem with that is you're only allowed to look at that stuff from the machine that it's on. So in order to deploy this, you need a full version of IIS, which again is Microsoft's web server. It's Microsoft's Apache, whatever you want to call it. I did not check, but I guess it might have even been possible. I guess I should have checked this to see if it's possible to deploy something using XAMPP. But since again, XAMPP is not set up, it's not a Microsoft product, I don't know if it's at all possible. But since you're here and you're kind of my captive audience, what we're going to do here is I'm going to say, can I deploy an ASP.NET application using XAMPP? How to run ASP.NET on XAMPP. Okay, well, it looks at least like it might be possible. So I can take a look at that. But let's see. Download and install XAMPP. We already have that. Download and install mod_ASP.NET. It says next you will need to download and install that, which allows ASP.NET pages to be ran under XAMPP. It says you can download the latest version here. When running the installer, it may take a few minutes. Okay. Step 3, you go in and you edit your configuration files. This isn't the kind of thing I really want to do right before the end of the semester. All right. So, and for that reason, I'm not going to. But they do go through the steps here, and what I'm going to do is grab all of that stuff. Again, I have really no idea whether or not this is going to work, but I'm going to grab it, and if I can at least, I'm going to try to take a look at that and see if indeed it is possible to do this. So just so you know, this is how I spend a lot of my time, is going out on the net, looking for things, copying them out there, so hopefully at least I get some time later that I can go back, try to test it and see if indeed that is possible to do. I don't know why, but it just hit me. Hey, why don't I try doing that and seeing whether or not I could do that in XAMPP. I never actually thought of trying to do it before, so I should have, but I never did. All right, so it's probably not set up the best way, but all right. I do promise, if I can, I'm going to try to come up with time to at least see if this would be possible. It'd be kind of neat to try it. All right. So, for now at least, I'm going to save that. I'll save it out here. That'll work. Let's just throw it in here. I'll make something with today's date on it, which will be 12/01/2015. And I'll put that out there. Okay? If I think of it, I might ask John Wanda today if he can investigate this, and I've given him a project already. He can try to see if he can set this up. Okay? We'll see. Wish I'd thought of it earlier, but I did not. All right. So, What they're saying is here, whether you're hosting the site itself yourself or you're using an external web host, you're likely to have different settings. I guess the problem with using XAMPP, just so you know, is you're still using it on an individual machine. All right, it says to deploy your website to a production server, the deployment options are shown in the table that's on the bottom of 727 and the top of 728. First is file system. As it says, it enables you to create a copy of the website on the local file system of your developed machine. It's useful if you want to move files manually to a production server later, or if the server is accessible over a local network. You can set up an FTP site, which allows you to send the files that make up the web app directly to a remote server using the file transfer protocol. You can use web deploy, which enables you to send files that make up the web app to a remote IIS server. It needs to have web deploy for hosting servers installed. It says many providers provide this option, which makes it convenient. Finally, you can create a zip file with all of the site's information on it that an administrator can deploy. It says for more information, see right here, http bit ly. I don't know if that's a 1. Let's go and try that. How to create a web deployment package in Visual Studio. So again, as I oftentimes do, revealing all of my secrets to you here. Usually I pretty these up. I'm not really that concerned with that right now. All right. I'm more concerned with keeping kind of stuff together here so you can see what I'm doing. So, all right. And what I'll do is I'll take, and in that same folder, I'll put this document. All right, so that's out there as well. All right, let's jump back into the book. It says you can select among these options when you publish your site, as you'll see in the next exercise. Before you deploy the site, you should check the state of it. It says you should do a full recompile where Visual Studio compiles all the code and all the pages. That way, if there are any problems or any changes you made, you can be sure you got the freshest, all right, and most up-to-date stuff. To keep it as lean and mean as possible, it says you should also delete any files that you don't need in the production phase. All right, so if you did add anything special that was set up for the testing phase, you can now get rid of it. So they go over how to do this next. And again, I'm just going to walk you through it, but that's all I've been doing in here, okay? Close all open files in Visual Studio. Choose Build, Rebuild Site. It says doing so forces Visual Studio to recompile the entire site, even if it's already done parts of it. It says it may list problems you may have in your error list. To verify that your site is error-free, open it. Make sure you don't have any compile errors. All right, if you do, go and fix them. When the list is empty, right-mouse click the Solution Explorer and choose Publish Website, which brings up the Publish Website dialog box. Fairly simplistic in nature, as you see here on the top of page 729. Click the drop-down at the top of the screen and choose New Profile right here. Enter the name that you want to use for it. On the Connection tab, choose File System. In the text box for the target location, enter wherever you've got your project currently stored, or I'm sorry, where you want the project to be stored. It doesn't have to exist yet. Visual Studio will create it for you. When it publishes the site, click Next. In the Settings tab, the debug should be selected. I guess it doesn't show it there. I thought maybe it would. And you'll need that for the next exercise. Click Next again. On the Preview tab, click Publish to start the publishing process. On the Solution Explorer, click the refresh icon and expand the app data folder. You should see a file that's called, whatever you saved it as, with a .pub XML under the Publish Profiles subfolder. And if you open that, you should see that everything has been copied over. So on 7:30, they explain how this works, which is kind of what I just explained to you. So I'll let you take a look at that yourselves. They do mention down towards the bottom here, when you complete the Publish Wizard, the Visual Studio stores the settings in a Publish Profile file, something with a pub XML extension. It's used whenever you publish the site, so it remembers it. So if you have to republish, it can use this file. It also says it maintains multiple versions of the web.config file. All right, so the next thing that's discussed here, and again, this is about as heavy as it gets, is the web.config transformations. It says if you look in your current web.config file, you're likely to have a few settings that are different on your production server. All right, so it says to avoid overwriting the changes in the production server, developers often skip deploying the web.config file and then manually update the server, these settings rather. That way they've got control over doing that. In order to be able to do this and use what's referred to that Microsoft has created called web.config transformations, all right, and then again, that's used to generate a web config file from your main web config file for the project, but adjusted with settings specific for your production server. All right, you need to add one or more additional .config files to the project. These are named after the publish profiles that we created earlier. And they show you an example of these on the bottom of the page. Again, if you want more documentation, you can go out here. Again, I'll save that. I wouldn't even try to do this stuff because this is way over my pay grade. It's way over and above anything I've ever tried to do. All right, so I'm putting some of the information out there, but again, I'm not the person that you'd want to talk to about actually doing this because I haven't done it. All right, so I'm just walking you through the process as the process is explained in our textbook. I think that's about enough. Grab that URL and throw that into the heading. Save the file. So you've got that stuff in there right now. All right. Again, they give you examples in the book here. Okay. On the bottom of page 731. They go through an exercise on actually doing this on 732, 733, and 734. I'm not going to go through it. All right? You can walk through the stuff yourselves if you have an interest in doing so. All right. Installing and configuring your web server. What happened was, years ago, by default, IIS used to be installed by default on a system. And then what Microsoft found was a lot of people were not using IIS. So they asked that it be turned off by default. All right. So although IIS ships with versions of Windows, it's not installed by default. The good news is it's just going in and flipping a couple switches, basically, and setting it up. So it says to install it, you need to be logged on as an administrator. All right. In addition to installing IIS, you'll also see how to create and configure the website in IIS. Because the way security works under Windows, your site probably won't work immediately after you do the configuration. It says you'll be able to test it out more easily if you already have SQL Server Express installed. We already do. So making sure that IIS is installed here on page 736. It says the easiest way to do this is through the Web Platform Installer, or WPI, that came with Visual Studio. It says you can also download it, and it gives you the thing here. It says, all right, it says once it's installed, it may start automatically. When that happens, close it to clear out anything that's been opened. Start it from the Windows Start menu or from a Start screen. When it does, it'll show you the different stuff that's in here. All right. It says switch to the Products tab, and at the top of the screen, enter IIS recommended. And it'll show you this. It says click Add to add the items to the list of items to be installed. If the Add button is disabled, it says parts of IIS are already installed. Next, use the search box, search for IIS ASP.NET. All right, it says that it depends on the version you're using. We're using 4.5, I believe. All right. For detailed instructions on doing this, it says you can use one of these. What I'll do is, rather than waste anybody's time going over there and manually doing that as I did before, I'll bring this up and I will put those out there later, okay? Installing and configuring ASP.NET on page 737. It says if you've installed Visual Studio 2013 on your target machine and already have the .NET, you already have the .NET framework installed. If you've already installed the 4.5.1 on your machine and installed IIS afterwards, it says you need to tell IIS about the existence. And they explain how to do that here. All right. Again, it's not really worth your time to have me sit and read out of a book to you. All right. So one of the most important exercises in the chapter is the one that starts on 738 and it goes through the top of page 741, and that's configuring your site. So it says you learn how to configure a standard default website that ships with IIS. So the idea is if you can do this, you should be able to go back and configure your own website to use it as well. All right. So they go through the steps here. Open the IIS Information Manager, expand the stuff that's there. Select the .NET 4.5 application pool. And they go through the steps as mentioned before. This is way above anything I've ever done. But they do show you, it's kind of nice on page 740, what this should all look like when it's done. Now, each new IIS installation has a default website. And by default, it goes to http://localhost. So what we did, or what they did in this exercise, is they configured the default website to run Planet Rocks. But it's also possible that you can create a whole new site that can run side by side with other websites. And the final thing you need to do to make sure your site runs on a local IIS installation is to configure the security settings. And that's what they start to discuss on page 741 here. So the author says, you're doing a heck of a lot here and you may not realize what's happening under the hood. All right, but some stuff is. And it says most of the time you only have two scenarios to consider: using IIS Express or using a full-fledged version of IIS. So what they mention on the next page here on 742, it says you need to make changes to your Windows file system so that the web server is allowed to access the resources. And they show you what you have to change here. Then they go through on 742 and 743, 744 and 745, and actually configure the file system. All right. On 745, 746, and 747, they mention some of the problems that you can run into when you do this. It says if there is an error, it is an error to use the section registered as allowed this. Maybe you've seen that message before. I've gotten it before too. It says you get this error when your website is not at the root of the web server. All right. So typically it's when you set up a file structure incorrectly. The 401.3 unauthorized, it says you get this error when the account used by the web server doesn't have permissions to read files on the disk. Well, if you've logged in as an administrator, you should be able to change that. Failed to update database happens if the database is set to read only. So again, as an administrator, you have to go in and change that. 403.14 forbidden. It says this is often caused by an incorrect or missing default document. 404 not found when you've got a file missing. You can have errors when you try to connect to the server. They mention that there. Failed to generate a path or a user instance of SQL Server due to failure in retrieving the local user's application path. You have to check and make sure that indeed that path was set up correctly. A 500 error. As it says, you get this error when ASP.NET is not registered with IIS. And a runtime error, which you can get for a variety of reasons. So the idea is you want to put it on IIS to make sure it works. But previously what they talked about was releasing this to a local copy of IIS. All right. So next what they talk about, starting on the bottom of 747, and it's really the last exercise that's in here, is how to move it to your own server. Okay? And they start to go through this. It says you see how to use the SQL Server Management Studio to export your actual database file. And they go through those steps on 748 through about 751. Let's just finish this up by going through the deployment checklist. I do apologize in advance if any of you do watch this and think, wow, you didn't say very much in here. It's because I've done very little with the stuff that's in here. All right? And rather, like I said, than me reading out of the book, I try to hit what I consider to be some of the high points. All right, so deployment checklist. Make sure you don't have debugging enabled in the web.config file. All right. It says this causes unnecessary overhead, decreases performance. Remember, too, if you are going to have debugging in there and you have it set to true, and this goes onto an application server, that means that if there is an error, that rather than seeing a generic error page, typically users will see the actual error, which makes it much easier for somebody who might be trying to break into your system. Make sure you've got custom error setting on by default. So again, rather than showing those errors, you can have your own custom error page. Disable tracing. You may or may not remember tracing from an earlier chapter, but that just shows a lot of information. Again, a lot of information that could conceivably be used by people or hackers trying to get into your system. It says consider setting the retail attribute of the deployment element in the machine.config to true. It says this section is used to indicate that the server hosts production-ready versions of sites. Again, you need to be an administrator to do that. Scan your site for important files that may contain sensitive information. Make sure that those files cannot be accessed directly. Make sure you turn on error logging. It says that's being turned on for the administrator so that you're notified when an error occurs, so you can go in there and fix it. All right. On the bottom of 752 here, if you're trying to use themes in the site, make sure you remove the style sheet theme attribute from the pages in web.config. And that's pretty much it. So again, I will come back tomorrow, and since I'm doing this kind of in reverse order, I'm going to go over personalizing websites. And then hopefully on Thursday, I'll do the security in the ASP.NET website. Then next week, because I want to go back and redo all those exercises. I did them, but it was last summer, and I want to make sure they all work. So I want to do the work for chapters 14 and 15, and ideally I'd like to do that at home over the weekend. And that's about all I have.